Padma Shri Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi, Emeritus Professor, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha, Principal, ARSD College, Dr. Vinita Tuli, Convener, Webinar Committee, Mr. Dipankar, Nodal Officer, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav Committee, faculties, students, and participants. I, Apra Sinha, on behalf of Atmaram Sanatan Dharma College, University of Delhi, welcome you all on this webinar on Indian economy under British rule, organized under the aegis of Internal Quality Assurance Cell as a part of its celebration of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, 75 years of independence. Special welcome to eminent speaker of the day, Padma Shri Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi, Emeritus Professor, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, and renowned economic historian. We are honored to have you, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for giving your valuable time. Under the guidance and support of the principal of our college, we are able to organize such webinars. Now I invite Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha to welcome our speaker and say a few words.
Thank you, Dr. Apra Sinha. Honorable Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi, Emeritus Professor, Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. Today's speaker and respected guests for this webinar, Dr. Vinita Tuli, Coordinator IQAC, Dr. Dipankar, Nodal Officer for the program Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, Dr. Apra Sinha, who is coordinator for this program, colleagues, and my dear student. On behalf of Atmaram Sanatan Dharma College staff and students, I welcome Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi in this webinar. Professor Bagchi is going to deliver his lecture on the very important topic, Indian economy under British rule. I am thankful to him. I express my gratitude that he has given his valuable time for all of us. I hope that everyone who is present and attending this webinar is going to learn something about this subject. In fact, we are celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Since July, we are organizing series of webinars, programs, different competitions, and in this series, we are organizing this webinar also. So once again, I welcome Padma Shri Professor Bagchi in this webinar, and I hope that we all are going to experience a very good lecture, wonderful lecture. In fact, I would like to say, thank you so much, sir, for giving us time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It is my honor and immense pleasure to introduce Padma Shri Professor Amiya Kumar Bagchi. Professor Bagchi is a distinguished Indian political economist. His contributions have spanned economic history, the economics of industrialization and deindustrialization, and development studies from a Marxist perspective, incorporating insights from other school of thoughts. Among Marxists, he is known for his extensive contribution to theories of imperialism and underdevelopment. He was awarded the PhD degree at Cambridge University and has taught and guided research students of many institutions and universities, including Presidency College, Kolkata, University of Cambridge, UK, University of Bristol, UK, Cornell University, USA, and was formerly Reserve Bank of India Professor of Economics and Director, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Until 2005, he was a member of the State Planning Board, the Government of West Bengal, and served as chairman of a committee appointed by the Government of West Bengal to report on the finances of the government during the 10th five-year plan period. He acted as the official historian of the State Bank of India until 1997 and founded the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata in 2002 and directed it until his retirement in 2012. He's a member of the editorial and advisory boards of many journals like the Cambridge Journal of Economics, International Journal of Institution and Economics, The Social Scientist, and others. He has authored many books, to name a few: The Political Economy of Underdevelopment, a 4-volume history of the State Bank of India, starting with the evolution of the State Bank of India, The Public Intervention and Industrial Restructuring in China, India, and Republic of Korea, Capital and Labor Redefined, India and Third World. India has made a transition from a colonial subjugation to freedom. It has emerged as an independent nation state. Though India is a modern nation, it embodies an ancient and rich 5,000-year-old civilization in its essentially pluralistic social, cultural fabric. What effect did colonial rule had on the Indian economy? Is economic modernity a justifiable excuse for nearly 200 years of oppression? What did the British achieve in India, and what did they fail to accomplish? What were the challenges that India faced at the time of British conquest, and what happened in those critical areas during the British rule? With these questions in mind, I now invite Professor Bagchi to deliver the talk. Over to you, sir. I think Ravinder, you need to, yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Respected Professor, Principal Jha, Dr. Sinha, and other staff and students of Sanatana Dharma College. I'm very glad to be able to address you today on a subject on which I have researched most of my life. I have taught and researched from about 1958 to 2012. So it is always gladdens my heart to be able to address students on a topic on which I have done some research. The subject that has been advertised as Indian economy under British rule, I should have really said it should be Indian economy and society under British rule, because you cannot discuss the economy of a country without discussing some aspects of the society of that country. India was not the first country that the English or the British conquered. The first country that the British, rather the English, because the English became merged into Great Britain only from 1707, when Scotland and England had a treaty of union. The English conquered Ireland in the 12th century under the reign of King Henry II. But the Irish rose again and again against British rule. Until the 16th century, many of the English who went to Ireland became absorbed there and became really like Irishmen. But the cleavage became very prominent when England adopted Protestantism under King Henry VIII, while Ireland retained its Catholicism. After that, there are several revolts, and every revolt was suppressed with exemplary brutality by the English. There are genocides at the end of the Queen Elizabeth I's reign, when the great English poet Spenser actually was involved in that genocide. Then there was another revolt in the 1640s, which was again suppressed by Oliver Cromwell in 1650 through genocide of the Irish and disposition of the Irish of much of their land. Then a third revolt took place during the reign of William of Orange, and in the 1690s again there was genocide of the Irish. And finally, in 1840s, there was the Great Irish Famine, when 1 million of the Irish died, and within about 2 decades, 1/3 of the Irish had either died or emigrated. So in some ways, Ireland was a laboratory for British colonialism in other countries. England had conquered Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, from the 17th century onward, and English settlers had gone to the North America from the time of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, and this settlement also involved enormous genocide of the American Indians. The Spanish had got there earlier, and it is estimated that in Spanish North America, which included at that time current Mexico and Texas, California, and much of Western United States, there the original American Indian population had been somewhere around 26 million, and by the end of the century, it had come down to 1.5 million. And in the United States also, the original population of the American Indians was estimated to be about 20 million. And by the end of the 19th century, only 300,000 of them are there. So colonial rule involved not only the oppression of the people, but an enormous genocide of those peoples through diseases which are unknown to the American Indians, like smallpox, through the deprivation of their lands and so on. So the template for British rule in India was already drawn up by the time that the British conquered Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. English, it has sometimes been claimed that it was an accident. It was not at all an accident. It was the result of an expansionary policy of the English East India Company for a long time. In fact, Josiah Child, the director of the East India Company in the 1690s, had tried to challenge the Mughal Empire at that time, but had been sharply slapped and defeated by Aurangzeb's army at that time. The opportunity came when the young Siraj-Dowlah, who had very little experience of statecraft, came to the throne, and the British conspired with his general Mirzapur and others to take over Bengal. The exploitation of India yielded enormous riches for Britain. The British Empire at one time spanned practically all the different continents of the world. They had colonies in the Caribbean, they had colonies in the Falkland Islands, they had colonies in Australia, they had colonies in Hong Kong and other treaty ports of China. They had colonies in Africa, in South Africa, in Rhodesia, and so on. But the Indian Empire was the jewel in the British crown. It is from there that they extracted the largest amount of surplus, which was used for supporting the industrialization of not only Britain, but also overseas settlements of the Europeans. In 1913, the total British foreign investment amounted to somewhere around 4,000 million pounds. Of that, something like 4/5 to 5/6 had been extracted from 1870 to 1915-16 from the Indo-Burmese Empire. So that much of what the British foreign investment came to were originated in the exploitation of India and Burma. For exploiting these countries, the British needed to suppress their domestic demand. What the British did was to impose what amounted to something like a structural adjustment that the International Monetary Fund imposes on a country which becomes indebted to foreign creditors like the United States or foreign banks. A structural adjustment program generally means that the domestic demand has to be suppressed, domestic consumption and domestic investment has to be suppressed. And for that reason, what they had to do was to extract whatever debt servicing charges they could from there in order to satisfy the foreign creditors. In the same way, Britain extracted a surplus from India, which is unrequited in the sense that there is no return payment for it. And this surplus generally took the form of land revenue and salt tax. There is a steep salt tax on the commonest consumption item of the ordinary people, and it was against that salt tax that Mahatma Gandhi carried out his famous Dandi March in 1931. The land revenues that were extracted were at first primarily from Bengal, because Bengal was the richest province that the British had conquered. Bengal meaning at that time Bengal and Bihar. And that land revenue not only satisfied the investors of the East India Company, which had who had actually invested in order to get profits out of that, and that also afforded the wherewithal to conquer other territories, like the two most obdurate powers that the British had to suppress were the Marathas and Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan was conquered in 1799 at the Battle of Srirangapatnam, and the Peshawar were conquered at the Battle of Kirki in 1880. And that more or less settled the question of paramountcy of the British. The only territory that remained to be conquered by the British was Punjab under Ranjit Singh. And Ranjit Singh, in fact, predicted what would happen. And then the British took over Punjab also at the Battle of Gujranwala at the end of the 1840s. The surplus extracted from India and Burma supported not only the foreign investment of in the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, and partly also South Africa and Rhodesia, but it also supported the migration of the Europeans to the overseas territory. The most important destination of the migrants was the United States. Between about the 1840s or 50s and the beginning of the First World War, somewhere around 40 million Europeans migrated overseas, the largest mass migration in history. And the means for settling them came quite a bit out of the surplus extracted from India and Burma. Partly definitely came also from the profits that the British enterprises made in other countries, but the large share came from these countries. So that one can say that towards the rise of the United States as the richest country in the world, the surplus expected from India and Burma was a great help. As I said, one cannot discuss the economy of a country without discussing also its society. The British also tried to change the Indian society in various ways. One of the most important objectives of Nicholas Minute in the 1830s was to create a class of Indians who would be Indian in appearance, but in mentality, in dress, in other aspects, would become like Englishmen. They'll think like Englishmen and they'll support English rule. And they succeeded in creating such an elite. They rewarded this elite with titles like Raja, Maharaja, Rai Bahadur, Rao Bahadur, Khan Bahadur, Rao Sahib, etc. But at the same time, what happened was it is out of this elite that the seeds of the independence struggle were sown. In fact, the first person to compose a hymn in the in honor of the mother was Henry Louis Vivian Dirozio, who was an Indo-Portuguese young man, and it is the Dirosians who first thought of trying to free India from British rule. But it did not depend only on the Dirosians. In Maharashtra also, in the beginning of the 1840s, a group of young men pinpointed the exploitation of the British and wanted that rule to end. So that even before the Great Revolt of 1857, there are many seeds sown of the final freedom struggle, which was launched by Mahatma Gandhi from 1920 onward. Now, during this period, as I said, the British created an elite, but they also did something which has remained as a difficult legacy for us. They changed the laws wherever these laws interfered with the extraction of taxes from the Indians, but whenever they could, they not only retained the older laws, but strengthened them. They codified the Hindu succession laws like Hitaksara and Dayabhaga, and through that codification, they actually rigidified these laws. In the same way, in the censuses, they began classifying people into castes, and then people began to demand their own classification, so that many castes which had been interchangeable earlier on became rigidified. For example, in Bengal, many of the Sodgopes had earlier on, let us say, Sanskritized or ennobled themselves as castes. For example, Raja Radhakanta Dev of North Calcutta was one such man. But with the codification of these castes, this became more and more difficult. And people then began to think of themselves as belonging not only to caste, but also to subcaste, who don't marry between themselves, among themselves. And what the British also did was to degrade the position of the women in their property rights. For example, in the general Islamic law, the women had a separate property right to the husband's property. But the British only recognized the man's property. In fact, in Britain also, under British law, until the suffragette movement, when a woman married, she suffered a civil death. When I examined the documents of the Bank of Bengal, I found that whenever a European woman borrowed money from the bank, the husband always had to be guarantor because the woman had no separate property right to it. So in this way, the deprivation of the women, which was already codified in those laws which followed monospirity rather than other kinds of old theological works, these were rigidified by the British. The British also claimed that they had brought civil law, brought in civil society into India. Now, a civil society demands that the private and public spheres of operation should be totally separate. Now, what happened was that this separation occurred in two different ways. In the British courts, the public sphere was generally the sphere of property rights of different people, but in Indians, in trying to defend themselves, rigidified the patriarchy that they had, and they defined a separate private sphere for women. So that many of the laws which are quite rational, like Vidyasagar's attempt to introduce a law forbidding child marriage, he succeeded in codifying widow remarriage. Widow remarriage actually had been prevalent on lower castes earlier. It is only when the lower caste became aware of the rigid classification that had been brought in that they also imitated that. And when in the 1890s, there was an attempt to ban child marriage. It is the Orthodox Hindus who thought they were defending their own rights that they opposed them very much. The British also discriminated in courts of law against Indians. When Lord Ripon was Governor General, the law member of the Viceroy's Council, Sir Courtney Ilbert, tried to introduce a law in which Indian juries could also try Europeans in criminal courts. But there is stiff opposition not only from Indians from Europeans in India, but also from Europeans in Britain, and the British opposition was spearheaded by Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, who had been law member of the Viceroy Council earlier. So that failed. So that, in fact, the law discriminated against the Indians and the Europeans in most spheres of life. There is not only the codified discrimination, but also uncodified. For example, in the presidency banks, which are the Bank of Bengal, which was founded in 1809, the Bank of Bombay, which had been founded in 1840, and the Bank of Madras, which was founded in 1843, the Europeans could get cash credit in the sense that they could mortgage their tradables and get cash credit on the basis of that. But Indians could not. The Indians always had to deposit government paper in order to get any loans from them. And later on, they had to deposit railway documents for getting any loans. Even many big businessmen like Darkar Tagore, the grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore, had to deposit government bonds in order to get loans from them. And also, when the banks dealt with the stockbrokers, for example, the Bank of Bengal gave a larger discount to the European stockbrokers than the Indian stockbrokers. And in other areas also, Indian businessmen were discriminated against. For example, they were discriminated in the allotment of railway wagons. So that in the cotton trade, for example, the Indians had been in Bombay the dominant partners, but when the new techniques of hydraulic press came, and they could be pressed like by the hydraulic presses, and railway wagons are allotted on a preferential basis to the Europeans, much of the cotton trade went out of Indian hands, and in partly as a reaction to that, many Indians set up cotton mills in Bombay. So in this way, the Indians' economic upliftment was impeded by the colonial discrimination in the against the Indians in every sphere of life. It is well known that where indigo planters were operating, they were the rulers in that area. In Bengal and Bihar, they were the law. They could imprison the peasants who had defaulted on the amount of indigo plant that they delivered to the indigo planters. They could whip them. There is a famous play by Dinabandhu Mitra called Nil Darpan, that is the mirror of indigo, where you have the so-called Samchand, which was the whip that the indigo planters used to whip the peasants. They could also uproot the growing crops in a peasant's field with impunity if the peasants failed to deliver the agreed amount of indigo to the planters. So that in those areas, in fact, the rule of the British courts did not at all operate. And it is not only the peasants who were oppressed in this way, ordinary Indians who had nothing to do with the indigo planters also had to obey certain kinds of rules. So when a European rode on horseback, for example, an Indian had to step aside from the path, otherwise he would be whipped by him. There is a story by Rabindranath Tagore called Rajtika, that is the anointment of a prince. There you have a young man who had been educated in Britain and had acquired English manners, English accents, English dresses, and so on. When he came back, he thought that he would show his countrymen that he could deal equally with Indians. And generally speaking, he was quite welcomed by many of the English acquaintances, because they found that his manners and his accents, his dress, entirely conformed to their own notions of gentlemanly. Once he and many other Indian dignitaries were invited to board a train which was being run on a newly opened railway line. One of those, I suppose, narrow gauge lines. When he was in that compartment, British inspector of police entered it, and throughout all the Indians who did not have the European dress. But when this young man also thought he would follow his fellow Indians, the inspector said, no, you don't have to go. For a time he was pleased, but then he thought a little better. It occurred to him that there is a story that chariot of a god was being pulled by an ass, and people were bowing all the time to the chariot. But the ass thought that they were bowing to him. So he thought that what the inspector was doing was not bowing to him, but to the dress that he was wearing. And from then on, he completely gave up those dresses. As I said, they changed the Indian society in other ways also, rigidifying castes and communities. It is quite well known that from the time that the Muslim League was founded, the British had favored the Muslim League, and in fact, throughout their rule, it is the more religiously minded organizations that they favor. They would rather have an Arya Samaji conforming to their rule rather than Mahatma Gandhi opposing them in every which way. Unfortunately, many of the legacies that the British left in the form of fragmentation of our society have been with us. The British also introduced a forest policy in the name of conservation. That forest policy actually amounted to throwing out many of the Adivasis who were forest dwellers and taking over their land. India's environmental destruction accelerated under British rule. The East Indian Railway originally ran not on coal but on wood fuel. And for that wood fuel, enormous amounts of forests were cut down all over eastern India. And these railway lines were also laid without any attention to the contours of the land, so that they blocked the usual channels of water and created malarial swamps. West Bengal became an extremely malarious place, primarily because of the blocking of the old channels and creating of such swamps. And they led to a great rise in the mortality rate of the people of West Bengal and other areas which had been subjected to this kind of environmental damage. But the mortality was not caused only by these kinds of ecological damages, but also caused by the total absence of any support in times of starvation by the state. There are famines in India almost from the very beginning of British rule. There is the most famous one in Bengal was the famine of 1769, which is known in Bengali as Chiyatturer Movement. And this was followed by famines in South India, in Western India, and finally in Bengal in 1943. In these famines between about 1870s and 1910 or so, somewhere around altogether, I think 13 million people perished. There is a so-called famine code, but that famine code applied to only people who were actually starving. And by the time the relief came, the people are so emaciated that they could not actually digest the food that was given to them, and they died of cholera, diarrhea, and so on. And many died after the famine had gone through emaciation and malaria. So that one can say that British rule was also responsible for an enormous number of deaths of Indians. The ideology that was spread by British economics and economic historians like Vera Amstey or Lillian Knowles was that Indian poverty was caused mainly by overpopulation. But in fact, Indian rate of population growth was much lower than that of Europe until 1921, when there is when a different demographic regime began, and therefore there is no reason to attribute the low rate of economic growth in India to population overpopulation. In fact, I wrote my private investment in India, and it was published in 1972, partly in order to refute this kind of disinformation that was spread by the British authors. Unfortunately, there are still some authors like Niall Ferguson who think that empire is good for the conquered people, and somebody like Tirthankar Rai who denies that the British have deindustrialized India. against all the evidence that we have. I have shown on the basis of Buchanan Hamilton's surveys of the Bihar districts in between 1809 and 1913 that while the persons engaged in industry, that is meaning at that time handicraft industry, came to more than 18% in between 1819 and 13. It came down to less than 9% in 1901. Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti, who had taught in Delhi School of Economics, tried to show that the case of Bengal and Bihar was exceptional. But I found that in every case, for example, in the Peshawar territories, when the British took over from 1818, because the soldiers were disbanded, the demand from the Peshawar court declined. There was a massive decline in the secondary industry in those territories. Also, this was confirmed by the work of Ravindra Kumar and Sumit Guha. Also, David Lardon's work shows that in the Nizam's territories also, it covered most of Andhra Pradesh and southern part of Maharashtra and northern part of Karnataka. There was again a decline of the of people engaged in 1900 in secondary industry. At the time that the British subjected the Nizam to a subsidiary alliance from 19% to somewhere around 9% by 1901. It has also been claimed by Daniel Thorner and Krishnamurti also that the industrialization in India ceased after 1881 or 1901. But in fact, Raghavendra Chattopadhyay's work and in fact, Krishnamurti's own chapter in the Cambridge Economic History of India, Volume 2 shows that there has continued this industrialization in Bengal and Bihar and all over India until 1931. It is only, and also not only was there the industrialization, I have shown on the basis of my own work on the using old books, Husbandry and Internal Commerce of India, published in 1804, and Oshini Seth's PhD dissertation, that Indian per capita income actually declined throughout the 19th century. And more recent work by Angus Madison and the team of Tim Broadberry and Vishnupriya Gupta have shown that it's more conservative, but that at best Indian per capita income stagnated during the 19th century. There is a paper by Hatekar and Dongre which shows that Indian per capita income began to rise only after independence. So it is important to realize that there continues to be a distortion of the record of British rule in India. And many people are still admiring of the way in which the British had brought law and order in India. But I have already shown what kind of law and order that was. There is a paper by Nisar Hussain which claims that in fact the British were always using the law of emergency. The shooting down of more than 300 unarmed persons in Jallianwala Bagh by General Dyer was only the tip of the iceberg. Whenever there was a slightest sign of revolt in a sepoy unit, the British had no compunction in blowing off those sepoys from the mouth of a cannon. The retaliation for the revolt of 1857 was well known. All over northern India, soldiers were hung from the trees. Many of them were blown off from the cannon. And of course, the lands and of all those people were taken over by the British and then distributed to the loyal persons. I hope that in future there will be much more work on this by younger historians. I'm too old to do any new work on that, and we'll have a much better picture of the what the British did. I should not end by saying that the British did not bring us anything. What they did bring in was modern science. India had made great strides in mathematics, in astronomy. There is a claim that in fact the differential calculus of Newton and Leibniz was already discovered, invented by Indians in the 16th century by the Keralan mathematicians. There is a paper by the FRS Roddam Narasimha about it. But what the Indians did not have was experimental science. They had completely lost that, partly because of the caste system. At first, when the question of modern medicine came and vivisection of human bodies was required, most Hindus did not want to do that, and only Muslims or converted Christians did that. So that was an innovation that the British had brought, and it had done good for us. And there was also experimental medicine, which the British had, the knowledge of which the British had brought, but the British did not do real science here. The real science was done by people like Jagadish Chandra Bose, followed by C.V. Raman, K.S. Krishnan, Nilnath Shah, Satyen Bose, Venkata Raman Krishnan, Hargobind Khurana. So what the British had brought to us was something that we had to emulate and innovate further. It is important to retain this scientific temper and to not be blinded by various superstitions about Hindus knowing the how to build an aircraft or how to clone and so on. These unscientific tenets must be rejected by the students and the teachers in order for us to be able to progress further in this country. Many thanks for inviting me to this talk where both teachers and students are present. But if there are any questions, please talk very loudly because I am hard of hearing. Thank you very much again, Professor Principal Jha and Dr. Singh.
Thank you so much, sir, for an extremely illuminating session. And we are so grateful to you for sharing so much of knowledge with us. In fact, we have learned a great deal about the subject under discussion, Indian economy under British rule, under your tutelage, I should say. And your rendering of the subject was very unbiased, I should say, and also while you challenged and interrogated certain given aspects of this part of the history, you also provided, opened up many new roads for future researchers. So at ARST, we are extremely grateful to you, sir, for your valuable time and for your willingness to share your extensive knowledge and researches with us. And I would request our participants, our attendees who are here with us from different colleges of Delhi University, in fact, different part of the country, to raise their queries and observations, if there are any. Yeah, so while our participants take time to write down their queries in the chat, okay, we have one question by Sameep Sonkar. I'm reading out this question to you, sir. I hope I'm audible to you, sir. Yes. Sameep Sonkar is one of our attendee in today's webinar, and he wants to know that he has read that there was not so much unity in Indians
So, sir, don't you think it was more a mistake of Indians rather than exploitative nature of British rule? So this is
Say that again.
It's a very general question. He says, we have read that there was not so much unity among Indians during the independence era.
Oh, I see. Well, no, the freedom movement is not my specialty. I did participate in when I was a student of class 6 in the demonstrations demanding the release of INA prisoners and of the forward block prisoners, and participated in my student days in several other areas, but it is not my special area. The point is that originally the Indian National Congress was mainly the forum of well-educated and reasonably well-off Indians. And they generally came to those sessions in properly suited and bouquet. It is only the Tagore family, Jyotirindra Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, they went in an Indian dress to a session of the Indian National Congress, I think around 1891 in Kolkata. And from then on, to some extent, the Indian National Congress became Indianized. And then in the Indian National Congress, soon two different factions came up. One was led by Gopal Krishna Gokhale and another by Balgandhar Tilak. The Gopal Krishna Gokhale was a moderate politician who wanted to negotiate with the British to get more concessions from them. Whereas Tilak was a much more militant one. And he led the so-called extremist wing. While Mahatma Gandhi took over the leadership of the Indian National Congress from 1919, he was also militant, but in a different way. And he regarded the Gopal Krishna Gokhale rather than Tilak as his guru. You know the whole story of the civil disobedience movement, why he gave it up after the Chori Chora incident. I think it is not only because the Chori Chora incident violated his notion of morality, but also because he realized that the movement was flagging. Mahatma Gandhi was a great strategist. So that is why he decided to withdraw that movement. But he also was a constructivist. He did not want Indians only to struggle against the British, but also to do constructive work. His Chorkha movement, the Khadi movement was part of that. Tagore disagreed with him on that, but on the fundamental areas of the objectives of independence, both of them agreed. And Mahatma Gandhi's civil disobedience movement was in fact, to some extent, preceded by his own experience in South Africa, where he had also conducted civil disobedience against the discrimination against Indians by the Europeans there. And he had predecessors in people like Henry David Thoreau and so on. And so civil disobedience movement was actually a reenactment of his own experience. And that also he withdrew when he found that the movement was flagging. So he interpolated his own movements with constructive work throughout. And by 1942, he realized that there is no way in which he could negotiate with the British any further. There has already been a resolution taken by the Indian National Congress for full independence in the Lahore Congress. But that was only implemented thoroughly in the 1942 Quit India movement. And it is my belief that Mahatma Gandhi came to his greatest during the declining years of his political influence, when he did not want the partition of India. And he realized that the partition of India would do great damage to both parts of the country. That is all.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for answering to Sameer's query. Now, Nilanjan Chatterjee has written, my question is, as you said, that the exploitation of Indo-Burmese Empire facilitated the industrialization of not only the British, but also of other Europeans. How did the other European nations benefited from the British exploitation of our subcontinent?
Well,
Could you please reflect on this?
that the British, as I said, that the British had made 4,000 million pounds of foreign investment, most of which went to the United States, and the other parts went to Canada and Australia. What the United States did was to protect itself against British manufacturers. And Canada also did that. While they utilized the investment made by the British, they introduced protection. In fact, it was Alexander Hamilton in 1791, in his report on manufactures to the US Congress, who outlined the strategy that the British USA would follow. And by about the time of the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, the USA had already innovated the Whitney cotton gin and interchangeable parts in rifles. But the further progress of that was facilitated by British investment in the US railways, British investment in the steel industry, and so on. And that had to be supported by the surplus extracted from India. What happened was that India ran a large surplus with the United States and a deficit with Britain. And this deficit was filled up by the extraction of the surplus from India and then sent to United States. And this is the way that the US industrialization was facilitated by the extraction of the Indo-Burmese.
Thank you, sir, for answering this query. Moving on, I would like to take up the question given by Hardik Sharma. He says, feudalism was the order of the day when British came, especially Yajmani system being prevalent. This also gave base to our caste system. How did British imperial capitalist structure try to change this feudal system?
Well, let me say that the Indians did not have feudalism in the classical sense. There's a very good paper by Daniel Fowler. I won't go into that. The Indian notion of feudalism was primarily constructed on the basis of Todd's Annals of Rajasthan. Rajasthan did not actually portray most of India. In other areas, there was a different structure. For example, in most areas of India, there is a private property right. One of the myths that the British proclaimed was that there is no private property right in India. The sovereign was the owner of all property, and it is on that basis that they confiscated the land of all the zamindars, and the zamindars had to renegotiate with them. But in England, there was a proper feudal structure, and that feudal structure began crumbling first during the Black Death, when there was because of the enormous mortality of ordinary people, the wages of the workers increased, and gradually the profits that the feudal lords made from the lands became more precarious, and many of them then sold out to merchants, and gradually a bourgeois class came out. But that bourgeois class became consolidated from the time of Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII. When Henry VII first introduced protection against Flemish wool, which was the main competitor of English wool at that time. And then during Henry VIII's time, when he adopted Protestantism as the state religion, they confiscated all the lands from the monasteries and distributed them to the loyal courtiers. So that was the first step taken in the breakup of the feudal system in Britain. And then there was a civil war in the 1640s, and that finally led to the crumbling of all the feudal laws, feudal serfdom, and so on. And during the reign of Charles II, the remnants of the feudal system were totally taken away. But in the Indian case, as Irfan Habib had shown, it was a very peculiar situation where with enormous labor in the country and labor scarcity, Indians managed to create a land-based laboring class long before the arrival of capitalism. And it is that the subjugation of that class that was cemented by the Indian caste system. Many of the laborers belong to the so-called scheduled caste or Dalits. And in Bengal, what happened, many of the Dalits became Muslims. So one of the reasons behind the movement for partition of Bengal was that in particularly in East Bengal, most of the zamindars were Hindus and most of the peasants were Muslims. So in this way, we did not have any formal feudalism, but without any feudalism, we had created a landless laborer class, but that did not necessarily facilitate the rise of the bourgeoisie because land was still controlled by upper caste people, and many of these upper caste people, not only Hindus but also so-called Muslim Ashrafs, had privileged access to land and had privileged rates of land taxation. Both Nawabs and Indian kings taxed the Brahmins and the Ashrafs at lower rates than the others. And this is the way in which the rise of a proper bourgeois class was also impeded in India.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a detailed address to this question. I think you have already answered the second query of Nilanjan Chatterjee, where he's basically talking about the unholy alliance of the inglorious empire and the new elite, the zamindars and the so-called people who were getting benefits from the British Raj. So that you have very well put. And so I'm moving on to the next question by Dr. Balkrishan Negi, who wants to know what is your view about the low GDP growth during colonial rule, especially in the mid-19th century, apart from deindustrialization.
What is my view of?
Low GDP growth during colonial rule, especially in the mid-19th century, apart from deindustrialization.
Well, low GDP growth was very simple. As I said, it was a 2-century-long structural assessment program. The British had to depress the absorption by Indians. How could the GDP grow if the consumer demand did not grow, if investment did not take place? Much of the agricultural investment which had been affordable by Takavi loans in earlier regimes had been totally discontinued. How could GDP grow? Either in agriculture or in industry. For secondary industry, there was no demand for local cloth. The British made India the biggest market for their mill-made cloth. By 1913, British was exporting 3,000 million yards of cloth to India. How could the GDP grow either in industry or in agriculture under these conditions?
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I think Harsh Agarwal's observation doesn't seem to hold much importance here, because you have already talked about the positive outcome of the British imperialism in the independence history, in the history of India. So I'm moving on to the next question. Abhishek Kumar Gupta wants to know, don't you think that the prerogative being created by the Western writers on Indian economic history should be reassessed?
Sorry?
The prerogative being created by the Western writers on Indian economic history should be reassessed.
Certainly. I mean, it's high time to do that. The British are now compiling an Oxford history of the British Empire, and I find that in most of those histories, there is no mention of the work of R.C. Dutt, no mention of the work of Irfan Habib, no mention of the work of Ramdas Thapar. So Indians have to write a separate history of their own. and correct the deliberate misinformation or lack of information that the European writers are still committing about Indian history.
Sir, all our participants are thanking you profusely for clearing such ground and for giving so much clarity on the subject. And now I proceed to invite our colleague, Dr. Priyam Barua Deepak, to ask a question to you as she has raised her hand. Priyam, can you ask your question now? Dr. Priyam Barua Deepak, do we have you here? As I'm taking the questions and observations on the face of appearance, I just wanted Priyam Barua to come with a question. Okay, I'm moving on. Priyam needs to be muted. Okay, just a second.
Thank you. That's muted. Shubha, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I mean, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to read and listen to you always. And sir, the whole picture, the larger picture of the entire colonial political economy that you have upheld is something which has definitely a huge epistemological significance. Sir, now coming to my little understanding how much like I have read you and I have also heard you here is also about the structural adjustment that you have always talked about and how this transformation and this process of exploitation and expropriation of capital from India to from the colonial economy has actually worked as a historical process, and how this economic expropriation can be constructed, that you have always talked about, you have emphasized on. And definitely, sir, how you have kind of, this is one of my understanding of reading you. I mean, during like my PhD days and MPhil days, that how the whole kind of process of colonialism vis-a-vis Indian capital and one kind of a race-based discriminatory policies in relation to Indian capital, be it Indian capital, sir, like or kind of, you know, colonial protectionist measures, credit practices by the imperial banks, and manipulation of currency exchanges, like so on and so forth, sir. So these are kind of, and the statistical data that you have upheld always is irrefutable, definitely. I mean, that goes beyond doubt. My question is that, sir, that like how David Washbrook and you know, of his likes, they have talked about some kind of accidental risk aversion of a typical characteristics of the colonial economy, and how can it somehow also be linked to how it has been you know, propounded to be one of the like colonialism as a structure being a part of or a variant of the international economy, sir, and how kind of, you know, this operationalization, actually the operationalization of the whole process of colonialism, actually it happens. Can we take this as an international as a variant of the international market or international economy, and can this be backed by certain you know, the available cost benefit data? So this is my question, and thank you so much again, sir, for coming here and like so that we can hear you. Thank you, sir.
Well, if I understand your question, how is colonialism related to the whole operation of the international economy?
Yes, sir.
Colonialism is an integral part of the international economy, as I understood from history. In fact, when capitalism originated in the northern states of Italy, it was already driving for colony, because when it comes to making profits, capitalists don't know any regional barriers. So that from that time onward, Venice and Genoa conquered many islands in the Mediterranean and made them their colonies. So that you can say that capitalism and colonialism are co-evolved. The best example of this is that of the Netherlands. The Netherlands became a separate economy and a state after they revolted against Spanish rule from the 1570s. And from 1580s onward, Netherlands set on conquering all the territories that are captured by the Portuguese at that time, because the Portuguese were under Spanish rule from 1580 to 1640s. So they went to South America and carved out a bit of the of Brazil, which was under Portugal at that time, and that became the Dutch colony of Suriname. And they went to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and either made treaties with local sultans or conquered different islands and made Indonesia their colony. And Indonesia became, in fact, the richest colony of the Dutch. While the British exploited India and Burma, the rate of exploitation of India and Burma never amounted to more than 10% of the estimated GDP. But in the case of Indonesia, on the basis of Alec Gordon's and Angus Madison's work, I have calculated that sometimes it amounted to more than 100% of the total GDP of Indonesia. And it was the Dutch sugar which competed with the Mauritian sugar at one time and with Indian sugar. And the British also discriminated against the Indian produced sugar and Dutch sugar because the British had a great interest in Mauritian sugar. So that I do not want to go into all the intricate details of the international economy. It would take hours and hours to do that. But you can understand that colonialism has been an integral part of international trade and economic and investment movements from almost the very beginning.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for answering to this query. Now moving on, sir, there's another question which I would like to take up. This seems to be our last question by one of our participants, and related to that is my observation that what Shashi Tharoor in his book An Era of Darkness or Inglorious Empire says that Britishers basically had reduced a land of artisans, traders, warriors, merchants who were functioning and thriving, into an agrarian society of peasants and money lenders. So related to that, there's a question by Elia, who would like to know the difference between Indian economy under the Mughals and Indian economy under the British.
Well, that again is a very large question. I'm not an expert on the Mughal economy. The difference is that while the Mughals also took a large part of the peasant surplus, that surplus was reutilized within the country and led to the employment of artisans in urban areas. And also the Mughals gave particular concessions for the peasants to cultivate new crops like indigo, tobacco, and so on. So, none of these things happened under the British. So that under the Mughals, well, there are famines. The famines were less frequent, and also in some cases, not always, the Mughals also took special measures for relieving the famished people at that time. The basic point is that during the Mughal period, the circulation of the income took place within the economy and was not exported abroad. So that benefited the whole economy. One of the best let us say, indexes of the, in some respects, not in all respects, superiority of the Mughal economy to the British colonial economy was that during the Mughal period, the Indian population grew at a faster rate between the time that Abul Fazl made his survey in 1590s and around 1707 when Aurangzeb died, than during the British period from about the 1790s to 1901. So that I use that index as a let us say as a way of measuring the way in which Mughal economy surpassed in at least one respect in terms of population growth the British colonial economy.
Thank you, sir. Now, from here, we move on to the end of the program, the end of the webinar today. And starting with, I would like to extend a note of gratitude to all our attendees who have joined us today from different colleges. I would like to mention the faculty and the students of Mata Sundari College, Lakshmi Bai College, and Jesus and Mary College, and various other knowledge partners from Delhi universities. On behalf of ARST family and more particularly Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav Committee, it's my pleasure and privilege both to extend my gratitude to our illustrious resource person for the day, Professor Bagchi, for sharing his time and his extensive knowledge with our participants, for clearing the doubts of the participants in such a patient manner. And I would like to thank our Honorable Principal, Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jhaji, for providing all the necessary facilities for such exchange of ideas on numerous occasions. I would also like to thank our IQAC convener, Dr. Vinita Tulli, and the man behind this whole project, the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav celebration, the commemoration of the 75 years of India's independence, through which all of us have assembled together on this day and on numerous occasions, as it is an ongoing celebration. And for the next few months, we are going to have various programs and events. And I request our participants to check our website and also our Facebook page for the various events that are lined up here. And I'm extremely grateful to our resource person for summarizing this most debated topic and issue of the Indian history and the impact of British imperialism on the socio-economic trends and tendencies in such a succinct manner. And I also thank my fellow MC, Dr. Apra Sinha, for the generous introduction and also for the various interventions. From here, I would like to end the webinar today that we have organized on the occasion of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Thank you, participants. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all a wonderful day ahead. This is Dr. Shubha Dwivedi signing off from ARST College. Thank you.
Thank you.